Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of ASLA Virginia Presents Watershed Moments, where landscape architects, allied design professions, contractors, developers, we all gather to talk about this very complicated world that we operate in. At the core of our communication soft skills is not necessarily the information that we wish to discuss, but it's the act of getting that information through to a person. So because of these words, information and communication are often considered interchangeable, we forget that communication side really revolves around someone understanding your information accurately. So it's seemingly simple, but certainly not simple. Today, we're going to breaking down the foundation of getting this information through to another person. We're going to go over basically 5 considerations for this and review the 4 C's of communication. And I'm joined today by PJ Scully, a licensed and landscape architect and planning evaluation coordinator for Virginia Beach's planning department. PJ is our acting president for our Virginia chapter of ASLA and has been a huge collaborator with me getting this communications and leadership program started. So thank you, PJ, for being with us here, and welcome aboard to this show. I see you're in your studio there.
Rock and roll. Yes. So, it's a Friday afternoon. The kids are rolling home from work.
Nice.
The dog's running around the house. So, dad resides out in the garage with the surfboard in the background. And
yeah, I was going to say, it makes sense that the surfboard's there since you are in Virginia Beach. It would look a little weird if I had a surfboard, I think, next to me, because I'm not really able to hit the beach that much from Richmond.
Both my children swim like there's no tomorrow. So you throw them out in the ocean and they're like good to go.
They might leave you at some point, just swim away.
Probably.
So our last 2 sessions, if you didn't catch episode 1 and episode 2, episode 1, we're kind of starting this whole session of 12 episodes off by talking about the act of owning your communication and owning your ownership, basically being accountable for the message you're sending. Following that is the next step. We kind of talked about communication breakdowns. So usually they're either undelivered, they might be an incomplete message, or the message, in my case, I find is most likely misunderstood. The new topic we're going to be discussing today is about creating mindful connections. So PJ, I think that this topic is extremely close to home for us as a profession.
Yes.
If we kind of consider the elements of creating mindful connections, a lot of it has to do with figuring out our audience, the message, the messenger, you or your email, the time and timing of how you do this, and the method. And I don't know that landscape architects have always been the best at this or currently are the best at this, especially with communicating us as a profession. I know it's kind of a beaten to death topic with us, but the classic example that I have is whenever I explain to someone, I'm a landscape architect, and they don't know what it is, they lean to one or the other words. They're like, oh, you're a landscape designer. So you guys are mow and blow, you're coming to our house, love to have you over sometime to give me some tips. Or the opposite, they hear architect and they're like, oh, wow, so you're an architect. That's really crazy. That's so cool. And I'm like, no, we can kind of do both, but we're a landscape architect. Like, so how does it feel to be a landscape designer? And I'm like, yeah, we're not landscape.
Yeah, we're not. Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with landscape design. It's just, there is a process of what we have to be licensed to be called a landscape architect. And there's implications with that, like an engineer or with a licensed architect or any licensed profession. So kind of what are your thoughts as we get into this with the creating mindful connections that we might actually be doing wrong in the realm of professional landscape architects? Or right, I guess you could say that if you want to start on a positive note.
So I think what we're doing right is, I would say, because I look at my office, my department, okay, the city of Virginia Beach, and one of the things I oversee is all of our environmental regulations, ordinances, so liaison to our Chesapeake Bay board and our wetlands board. And when you look at the amount of shoreline the city of Virginia Beach has, I mean, we're pretty active, I think I was looking at it, we've got probably around 1,500 active projects, anywhere from small things to big things. Yeah, pretty extensive. You look at our development services center. So that's the hub for all private development when a plan needs to come in and be reviewed. The individual that runs that department is a landscape architect. You look at our Parks and Rec division, our design development, and the individual that runs that division, which City of Virginia Beach has a pretty extensive, Parks and Rec program here. The person that runs the design development team, the landscape architect. So when you take a step back, I think with the the education that we're receiving and the pride that we have in our profession, I mean we're stepping forward pretty aggressively.
Mm-hmm. Is Virginia Beach different than other places though, in terms of how that message has been communicated or the impact that the profession has had there versus some other places? Because I can think of Richmond, for instance. I don't know that landscape architects have that same weight to have influence in the city and the surrounding areas.
Right. No, that's a great point, and you're correct in some instances. Yes. Look at it, and even our former director of our department of planning, Barry,
Mm-hmm.
landscape architect. So I think a lot of it is, people being in those positions.
Right.
But I don't necessarily know, once we get into those positions, how far I don't want to say the advertisement, but letting people know, hey, we're landscape architects. I think we're just seeing these opportunities, and we have a lot of people that are knowledgeable and skilled enough to step into them.
Mm-hmm.
And they keep going forward and going forward. And I think what we need to do as a group is, spotlight or highlight those individuals, let our success be known. I mean, when Barry was, our department head, he was kind of pointing this out to me. My response back to him was, well, we're landscape architects. We're slowly taking over the world one position at a time, and just kind of brought it forward like that. Like, let's be proud of what we're doing, because when we're in these positions, we are succeeding.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at the people that I just named off, they've been in these positions for several years. So they have the skills and ability to carry themselves successfully, through life.
Do you think that we are trained on some of these connection points, so creating mindful connections with people, or do you think that maybe there is some lack in that for our profession in some areas? Because when thinking about what you said, yes, one big step is taking on the roles of influence and trying to have an impact on what the projects we're working on and what's accepted into the normal trade. But in other ways, is thinking about, once you're in those positions, how do you responsibly take that role to the next level where you're actually creating mindful connections with people to get things done? Or is the environment maybe part of that? If you have multiple people in those areas, does it carry more weight and maybe require less, really less influence of communication?
That is a great question. So I think environment does play a very important role. You got to think of it numbers wise as a profession. We might not be as saturated in an area, say, as architects or engineers.
Mm.
So when you get into a room, you're the small voice, you know, you don't have the numbers, and sometimes you see that, you know, people of same professions tend to collaborate and come together more and support ideas.
Right.
You got to think from an ideas perspective. A lot of people see us, I don't want to say as we're kind of the outliers. We think through problems and things differently. It may not be the norm. It may not be, you know, specific numbers driven.
People might look at us funny,
Yeah,
or think we might smell funny, or
well, just like when cheers to the Friday, it's smelling funny. Well, no, just like when you, at the beginning, when you said you introduce yourself as a landscape architect, and people say, oh, so, you know, how many people do you have on your crew, or, you know, things of that nature.
right.
You know, when
That's
you get
fine.
into some of these high level conversations, you know, particularly down here, you know, with us in regards to sea level rise and things like that, you know, it's where are the numbers to where I can quantify the solution that I'm providing.
Right.
And you know, sometimes it's not having a mathematical figure to the solution. It's looking at the creativity and the multiple, you know, social, economic aspects of everything. So, you know, we're kind of the outlier in that, and that kind of makes communication difficult, because if people are conditioned over decades to think a certain way, it's really hard to get them out of that. You know, for instance, like my parents, you know, the first time the ATM, automated teller machines, came out, they're like, no, there's no way I'm going to a machine to do my banking. You know, like I want to see that person. But, you know, kind of conditioning and seeing that it's a viable, you know,
Or
way
better
to
yet,
do
an
it.
example of like people taking a picture of their check and cashing it. It's like,
Exactly.
I mean, even for me, like my wife is Belgian, and she keeps telling me, she's like, America uses checks still? Like that was in basically a museum when we were like going through the
Right.
school system. That was like an obsolete piece of technology, like carbon
Yeah.
copies.
And I think, you know, that kind of transitioning or acceptance into a new way relates very strong with what our background is, what we're educated in, and how we need to communicate it. You know, one of the things that's very interesting and what I deal with. So there's two things. You know, as a landscape architect in a public office, there's culture. I mean, I can come to someone who owns a property and wants to develop it and say, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times they might say, all right, Mr. Government official, thank you. You know, just take a step back. I'm going to develop my property. Don't worry about it. Someone in the same profession, the landscape architect, can come in from a grassroots perspective, you know, from, one of our grassroots folks here, and say the exact same thing, and they would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, I will, you know, construct this living shoreline, or, you know, do this, that, or the other. So I think a lot of it is perception and how you perceive yourself, you know. And sometimes I even say some of our environmental groups, you know, their message is just blanked out right away, because they're like, this is my way or the highway. Like, you know, this is what you have to do. And that, you know, we're very strong in our opinion. And you got to maintain that, you know, essentially that flexibility, and be able to leave that memorable moment with, you know, your client or whoever it may be, to build that trust.
And ultimately, trust is, when you come down to it with communications, trust is the foundation of what you're trying to earn when you're communicating with someone.
Yeah.
When you get down to the point of communicating or sales or anything, the point is to obviously deliver a message or to assist or to provide a service. But if someone doesn't trust you and they don't understand what you do, then there is nothing. There's no advancing past that. There's a wall that exists.
Well, and one of the sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Because I just did it right here, and it was one of the things that we've learned, or we discussed. Don't compete for the space, and I think sometimes we got to be, when you're trying to make your presence or you're trying to share the knowledge that we have, because trust me, I've spoke with a lot of landscape architects, and I'm like, wow, brilliant, you very well-rounded. They try and get that into the space, and that was one of the things we talked about Wednesday, and I've got it written down here. Authentic, be interesting, be interested in people, don't interject too early.
Be in the moment.
Don't compete for that space, and kind of goes back to what I was saying, some of the people that I deal with, especially from the environmental perspective, they're very passionate for what they do, and they're very, in opinionated and to a point. And I think sometimes when you come off too aggressive like that, it automatically shuts down the person that you're trying to communicate with.
Right.
Because just like you have an opinion, they have an opinion. And in the long view of everything, we're all trying to work towards the same outcome. We may get there in a different direction or a different way. It maybe not be completely level, but we're all trying to get to some aspect of that.
And what you are talking about or getting into is actually the topic of the next show, which is understanding people and how you react yourself to people and their message, or how other people are likely to react to your message. And how can you shift your communication to better communicate with that type of personality so that you're not triggering someone into being defensive, or you're not triggering someone into feeling threatened by your position or the information you're giving or your profession. That all is critical. And I think we can either swing in both directions. Either we're too timid or submissive, or we don't feel like we have the answers or good enough opinions to pipe up, or we are too opinionated, where we are, like you described, with having too strong of an opinion. It seems over the top or aggressive or pompous. And a point that you just said, I wanted to write down. You were mentioning, like, in the profession, we often don't have the data to back up something as hard science. And sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But it is, I think, a contentious point that maybe is something to take note of. That if we don't have the data, that's going to be a portion of difficulty for delivering a message. So if we're thinking about the 5 considerations: who's our audience, what's the messenger, who's the messenger, the time and timing, and the method. So if we need to compete with data, then maybe there's a sect of landscape architects or more that are needed to actually find that data or research it. We're seeing some more of that, but there's not as much as we probably need. The other thing you pointed out was preconceived notions and trying to break those down. And that's going to be getting into what is that notion that someone has, and how do you identify the problems with breaking that down? And I wanted to use this as an example where we get into something that we as a chapter are facing. When I started going and visiting a lot of landscape architects back in 2018 and talking to people about ASLA, one of the biggest problems was the value of the chapter and the organization was not seen. And it was not false, it was true. If you're paying dues and membership, what exactly are we getting out of it? And there may be a sense that we were providing a lot, but it wasn't communicated. It wasn't getting through to the chapter members. So on that, we started talking about this over the past 4 years, and we've basically isolated some of the root causes. We've looked at, we need to add value to chapter members. We need to be more communicative. We need to be consistent and reliable. And all these things are kind of leading to, over the years, it's not a quick process, I think, always. But this has been leading up to why we're doing this program and trying to have that out, why we're working now with these episodes, is we had a plan, we had a problem, we try and solve it with this and try and execute it. And it's not going to be 1 year or 2 years, it'll probably be 3 or 4 years to get this done. But that's the interesting points about this, is that when you start to think of those 5 considerations, you can more easily break down a method to approach it, which I find fascinating. I've always loved a plan.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I think too, and we can't stop either, because it's ever changing, and how we communicate and value that we provide. And, even, with my group that I deal with, I said, just because you're out and you're in the profession doesn't mean you stop educating yourself. And I think this is program that we're going through is a perfect example of that.
Right.
Because communication changes. And just look at what we went through with the pandemic. Just simple fact of being in person, talking to someone one-on-one, doing what we're doing right now. So, you can't stop. And, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one that came up from the program on Wednesday. It was talking about, imagine yourself in a scenario where you are at a networking event and you have to describe yourself and your profession in a short 10-point thing, an introduction that is memorable and understandable to people, that has a message you want to leave behind. What do you think that you're able to go through that right now? Because that's something that I don't know a lot of landscape architects would think about ahead of time, me included.
So I actually wrote mine down.
Okay. Scripted.
From Wednesday. Well, no. So for all those that are, and I got a squeaky chair as I sit out in the garage here, and I had a son that just came in, that noise you heard in the background, that was him coming back from swim practice. So
a young landscape architect, I see.
Well, so actually my son is really leaning hard towards engineering.
Oh,
yeah.
Tragic.
Yeah. And he's got 2 of his buddies, so you'll probably hear them in the background and probably see them run behind me. But so that was a challenging exercise.
Yeah.
To come up with 10 points.
And put you on the spot right there too.
Yeah. And, so I had Stephen, for anyone that's, following along with these, what we're doing here.
Episode 1.
Stephen was so he's private sector and I'm public sector. And, that's a difference, and that was kind of challenging. So I just really quickly kind of transitioned myself into a role. And, we were kind of talking about this earlier, and, living in Virginia Beach, our goal is to try and keep people here, have people come here, have people return here, once they go off wherever and get educated. So first thing that actually came to my mind in my position, with trying to communicate, since I'm in a government setting, was, we're actually adaptive. And I think that's one of the stereotypes we have. People don't think that. They're like, oh, 9 to 5, don't answer their phone. We have a changing environment down here, and we are aggressively working through things to adapt to our environment, adapt to our community, adapt to the issues that we have when competing with other metropolitan areas. And from that, we have to be creative. And that's also another thing I don't think a lot of people realize, but when you're in the private sector, you're essentially in a design firm. And I didn't realize that at first when I got into the public sector. And it wasn't until I sat in on an interview panel for a city attorney position that our city attorney said, well, essentially, I'm running a law firm. And I was like, oh, shit. Well, that's really no different being in the planning department as we're reviewing these discretionary applications. We could provide that same type of service. So you had that adaptability, or being adaptive, to being creative, to then being understandable. And when I say understandable, I'm saying I'm coming from a comfort level. Like, we have a process, and the process is different from municipality to municipality, and we have to be understandable and actually create a level of comfort, to work with people. I mean, we want people to come here. We want them to call this their community. And with that, it kind of comes to not being so structured, and then from not being so structured to essentially being available, accessible, and being open to discussion. Things change. And if we don't think things are going to change, then we're not going to change. And if we don't change, then we're not going anywhere. It kind of gets back to the root of why we're going through this program. We're trying to advance and evolve as a profession, as individuals. And part of that is being able to communicate our perspective, our voice, our opinion, our passion, where we want to go as an individual, where we want to take our profession, both from a local perspective to a regional perspective to a global perspective. I think we have a lot to offer on that.
So here's what I heard in your message now. So your prelude to your message was talking about how there is a difference between public and private.
Mm-hmm.
The public sector has what we talked about earlier, a preconceived notion that a lot of people have, not everyone, but there is a stigma around the public sector that it can be bureaucratic and gets bogged down in rules and is inflexible. So your message, the reason that I'm pointing this out, is that you right off the bat address that, saying we're basically, our department that we run, we're adaptive, and we address that problem up front so that people already know that you're different than their notion, which is what we as a profession might need to do when we're addressing people that don't know about our profession. Just go ahead and admit that people probably don't know what a landscape architect is, and we need to talk about that up front.
Yep.
The second thing that you talked about was we're always learning, and we have a process of making people comfortable. So you're again talking about a stigma in the profession that needs to be addressed and how you are addressing it, which is another memory point, which is important for when people are going to leave that conversation. Will they think about you later, and will they remember anything? So you're going to be talking about them. You're going to be the guy who turned their notion of what they thought the profession was on its head. And then the last thing is you're talking about breaking down the structure and being more flexible. So all three of your points really got to problems that can be existing in a public sector job, which is memorable. You're taking that accountability up front with the message to change the message to what it is or what it should be in the profession, which I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. And, to just go a little bit further too, doing just what we're doing, continuing at, and just because you're in this position or you got a government job, you don't stop. You can't stop. Our environment isn't stopping. It's ever changing, and we have to keep up with that. We have to keep educating ourselves so that we can attract, those people. And then finally, where I work, we have a diverse background. And it's no different from our profession. You look at people that are landscape architects, and we run the gamut, and I think that is phenomenal. Like I was saying earlier, just the landscape architects that we have in our organization. It's amazing the diversity of roles that they play in forming this community. And the same thing holds true in the private sector. You look at, firms, from small firms to large firms, where landscape architects play in that, where we've evolved to. And it's a driving factor. And it really goes back to that diverse background that we have and showcasing that. Because I think it's a very viable part of our future.
Yep, I agree completely. I want to actually break down the one that I came up with when I was on the call, on the meeting on Wednesday, mainly because it's become important, very important to my career, to actually connect with people and to earn, hopefully, people's trust over time, that you can be someone that's trusted and understandable of their other person's position. So if I was meeting someone, it would typically be a landscape architect in a meeting that I would be consulting with. And so if I saw a landscape architect, I might introduce myself and not even mention anything about my job. And I've learned this over time, that what you did was address the preconceived notion up front. And in my case, I am taking a different method to it. I'm not talking about me or myself. I'm gathering information about the other person, because then I can figure out a better message that I might have missed the mark before. They might not understand what I do and then have a preconceived notion and then latch onto that. And then they're not listening the rest of the time at all. So I might start out saying, hey, I'm Gordon Edgerton. I'm a landscape architect just like you, but I've left the typical design consultant role and have actually started working consulting landscape architects. And I work a lot trying to see a lot of the problems that we faced when I was a landscape architect in your seat, and now trying to solve it. Can you tell me a bit more about your position? And that gets them talking. So the focus is on me, and then I quickly flip the focus back on the other person. And that way I can ask questions, figure out what they do, what they are passionate about, maybe get a sense of that person. And then at the end, I could say, well, that's great. Like, it sounds like you've got a great career. I love hearing about your surfing incident that you had the other day. Right. I work a lot with landscape architects that are in a similar position, and here's how we might have solved A, B, or C, which sounds like you might be, having a problem with that. Is that true? And they might agree, or if they didn't, they might clarify and say, well, actually, that's not true. We're more focused on this. So it's further clarifying what they're doing. So I'm trying to figure out the message. The timing for it comes for me at the end when I deliver that message. And then it's a focused, addressed message to actually get some level of confidence and to show the actual candor that I have to care about someone else, which the job should be. But we're in different roles, you and I.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the wheels are kind of turning here, but when it comes to that, I'm trying to think of where to, so that's the beauty of what we do, the different roles that we get involved with, the different roles that we take as a profession. What's been afforded to us. I mean, and I think holistically, we got to realize that as a profession of just how diverse we are.
Would you say that's an asset?
Oh, I believe it's a huge asset. I mean, you look at, just look at the group that we're dealing with in our sessions. and how diverse we are, from, public to private to
environmental design to
yeah, to,
design consultant to
right. And
entrepreneurs.
yeah, I mean, and it's almost like I don't know, it's going to sound wrong, but it's almost like, we are the entrepreneurs, and a lot of us don't have fears to break out of the stereotypical role, or what is perceived.
So
And
that's it right there. That's what I think, at least. One of the weaknesses that I felt getting into the profession, so leaving school and getting into the trade, I felt very insecure because I was very aware and cognizant of the fact that, like, I've had, all this, I had undergrad and graduate, so I was 7 years of school, and I left thinking, like, I don't know that I'm really the expert on any of this. I know a lot about a lot of things, or I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I don't know a lot about one specific thing. And it made me uncomfortable. And it wasn't until 10 years into my career professionally that I started to maybe change that thought of feeling actually glad that I had this breadth of knowledge and experience with different things, because it allowed you to connect with people and to get out of that preconceived notion. So you didn't feel like you were locked into just doing that one thing.
You brought up a good thing right there. You said you changed it, right?
It changed, I think, over time. I became more comfortable in my skin, I think.
But what we're doing right now, between you and I, having this conversation and trying to look at where we're going as a group, is we're creating that so that the generation below us, as a point of contact, they can see where we want to go. They can find a comfort level in talking to us, confiding in us, of what we're trying to do. And then it starts to snowball and it starts to build, if that makes sense. Like,
it's like a watershed moment.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you got to step out of your comfort level, which in a lot of times communication is, I mean, look at our group and some of the things that they said. They're like, which I want to speak out more. I want to, have that confidence or whatever. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to offer that opportunity so that they can gain that experience, so that when the person that they're working with or someone that just graduated college is in that same position, they actually have that leadership role to where then they can give them advice based off of the experience that they gained. Mm-hmm. And then that person doesn't have to figure it out on their own. That person can seek to us or seek to someone in the profession for that mentorship or that guidance. And then that just elevates them a step further, faster.
That's a good point to point out too, because we have that. I think ASLA National started a real press on their mentorship program.
Exactly.
Maybe we can include that in the link in the description to maybe get people involved with that, because I joined that about 1.5 years ago, and I've got a mentor out of Cary, North Carolina, and we meet monthly and talk about what her situation is currently, what are the challenges she's facing. And I don't always have the answers. Oftentimes it's more of a sounding board to work things out with a partner. And it's been very useful for her. It's been very useful for me to hear her side and to reflect on where I was at her.
Well, that's one of oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, it's fun to maybe reflect myself on that point in my career and make a comparison where I'm like, I was really not even at her level. Like, it makes you insecure for a second where you're like, no, that's stupid. Don't think like that. Like,
well,
you're doing all right.
Yeah. as a landscape architect coming, fresh out of college, I was extremely blessed to have a boss, Doug Arn, who's a landscape architect in Norfolk, Virginia. I went to work for him. That was back in 2000. This is February of 2022. I was in Norfolk this morning, coming out of an appointment right next to his office. I popped in, gave each other a hug, and to this day, we still talk. We talk about the, personal aspects, the profession, work through problems. He's got projects that come through my office. I ask him about, some design things and things to that nature. It's a connection. And I think coming out of this, as we're learning how to communicate, that's where we need to evolve it when we're done. And that is to, make that connection with people, through the mentorship program or, through, anything that we may do with our committees in the group, so that, you have a 22-year relationship based off of a profession that has grown, not just from a professional perspective, but a personal as well.
Yes.
And I think that's critical. And if we do that to, 2 or 3 people, then we're successable. But if
do you think that we are often aware of that? Like when we because so when I got into this program and we started, I didn't have a direct clue of who all was going to be involved or join. And I was very pleased that we got the people we got, of being from different backgrounds and professional lives and personal lives. Because I think there's almost like a realization in the program when we go in these, because you just pointed out, and I don't think I'd reflected on this yet, that oftentimes we're in our groups and silos at our company or in your department, and you kind of forget the breadth that we get into and hear the different takes on the profession. And so maybe that's not reinforced enough, that we're not having these connection points as a professional community where we can see the advantage of having this breadth of knowledge in different areas. I mean, to me, that was neat seeing Nicole, who's in environmental type planning and administration and getting grants written and advocating for the community in that regard, and Parks and Rec and the planning department and typical design consultants at small and large firms, different. And then looking at people who've started their own business, like all that stuff it's pretty incredible. And I think that it hopefully is bringing people a sense of togetherness in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it reminds me of, all right, so when I was in college, it was our land planning studio. And we go in on our Friday studio session or whatever, and we sit down at our desk. And one of the most valuable things that my professor did at that time was he came in on a Friday. We were already all starting to work, on our projects. And he said, all right, everybody stop, stand up, move 3 desks to the right. So we all moved 3 desks over. So someone else's project. And he's like, here's where you work today. So you got to see it from a different perspective. And I think that's just it. When you get into a project or you get into a profession, you can essentially get that tunnel vision. You look at a project for weeks at a time, you start to see past things, you start to overlook things. I think with what we're doing and taking a step back with regards to communication, bringing people in, any kind of education, you start to see other people's perspectives on situations, other people's perspective on, the profession. And it just kind of opens you back up. It's like taking 3 steps to the right and working on someone else's project for a day. And you're like, well, damn, I didn't think of it that way. Or damn, I didn't know that. And then it builds you as a professional. Now, where we fail is if we don't take that information and run with it or go with it or, acknowledge it. So
Yeah. And I think that with that forms of connection that we have, and that's the topic of the conversation, mindful connections with others. If we can form it
exactly.
within our own organization and people, then we're more likely to be able to form it with others outside.
Yes. Yep.
And I also think that this is a very broad-based concept that we're going over today, but really do focus as kind of maybe a closing remark for this one episode. I might say that if anything that we were taking away, or at least I'll speak for myself and then give you maybe a chance to have a closing remark on this topic, because it is very important without going into extreme hours of detail. But I did like their 5 points. If you remind yourself, okay, I need to send a important message to my client about my project, then you need to think about your clients as an audience. What are
Yep.
they, what is their intention with this project? Where might they, in my experience of dealing with them, see my message? How is it received? And how can I form it in such a way that they are more likely to understand and be clear about? You think about your method of delivering it. Are you going to email him? Or are you going to call him? Or are you going to go to his office if it's really important to actually sit down and talk about it? Or the timing, if he's rushing on a busy Wednesday afternoon, he's probably not going to be likely to answer you. And I should say he or she. And if he or she is in a bad time, then what's your method going to be to solve that? Maybe it's just choosing another time. Maybe it is pinning him down for lunch when he has a free moment and not talking about your message, but having a conversation to learn more about what he's doing in life so that you can better connect with him. Maybe that needs to be happening before. So that's really important. I think your audience, your message, who you are as a messenger, your time and timing, and the method you're delivering it. Like that's as simple as it can get, but it's so complicated with what's involved with those things.
No, I agree. And that is, again, your audience, your messenger, your timing on it, and the method. It's something that we all have to work on. And it's something that we need to realize in communicating. You communicate differently to the individuals, and it's almost like it's not a repeated or repetition.
Right.
I'm very grateful. I have 4 older sisters. I have to communicate to each one of them differently, and I think that's one of the things that kind of helps me, because they all have different personalities. They all have different perspectives. But they're all family, and I need to keep that connection. And I think we need to look at that the same way when we're trying to communicate ourselves as a profession. We're trying to advance ourselves as a profession and make those connections.
Right.
Is that, we have a message that we want to get across, but how we reach out to everyone has to be
tailored,
unique, just like our designs that we do. No site is the same. No analysis produces the same conclusions. So why would you communicate in a repetitious way, each way to every person? You know what I'm saying?
So can I say something?
Go right ahead.
It's going to add to this, I think, in a great way, but I feel like as designers, we are trained to be problem solvers. But I feel like in the profession, we often get trained to not problem solve, but to learn how the past problem was solved.
Yes.
And we do the same thing again. And we
That's
don't
very
approach.
Powerful.
It's powerful to me because it frustrated me so much. It almost crushed me when I was in the profession, because
right.
We'll get into this in the next session, but my personality type is very idealistic, which has positives and negatives to it. But I am very positive about thinking that a problem shouldn't be shut down by someone above you or someone in your office or your client. Like the idea of, oh, we can't do that because it didn't work that one time and we got burned on it. I think like that's such a terrible, terrible outlook to have as a designer who's supposed to solve problems. Like
It's the way we've
maybe
always
things
done
have
it.
changed. Maybe the
Yeah.
technology's gotten better. Maybe the site's different. Maybe the client's different. It's not the same thing over and over again. So to shut something down without even exploring a topic up front, I think is such a sad reality to a lot of our work this day and age.
Yes. Absolutely.
Well, we're about out of time. I'm going to leave us off with a note here that I wrote down. If we take away anything from this, if you're talking to someone and talking about the profession, focus on memory points. Let that be the thing. I thought that was an incredible way of thinking about what am I saying to someone about me or my job or profession or work, but make it memorable. So if it's not just a canned statement, but make it personal, make it interesting, and make it unique. And then someone's more likely to take away a message from it and actually remember it. And PJ, thank you so much for being on here.
Yeah, man, this is awesome.
We'll have you back on.
We had this conversation, what, about 6 months ago?
Many 6 months. Like we've had many Friday day night calls when we get a glass of wine or a beer and kind of kick back. And what'd you say? You kind of dump the information from the week onto the table and see what's relevant.
Just do a brain dump, kind of scramble it all around and pick something up.
Something's going to connect at some point.
There you go.
Anyway, thank you, PJ, and thank you all for tuning in and listening. Hopefully it's been an interesting and engaging conversation. We'll see you next week for episode 4, where we start getting into personality and how to talk to different people and their temperament traits. Bye-bye.
Rock and roll.